We are coming up on Tuesday to, we're down to our last two Arch story times. We've got one this Tuesday and one the following Tuesday, and then we'll be done for the summer. And this Tuesday, Mary Beth is, and whoever else is going to be joining her on this journey is going to be telling the story of Jonah. So I thought we might give a little bit of a start to see just kind of what we remember of this. First question being, who is the main character, who is the good guy of the story of Jonah? Jonah, right. It's like y'all expect me to ask a question and then give you a different answer. Who's the bad guy, or who are the bad guys in the story? What's that? Whale, a little bit, yeah. The folks from Nineveh, the Ninevites, he was called to, and then Eleanor kind of got ahead of me a little bit. Who wins the award for the biggest animal in the story? The whale. Now, so you were right to be concerned that I might be asking a trick question, because we aren't actually told that it's a whale. We're just told that it's a big fish. No, the only thing we know is that the biggest fish we had that could swallow someone and still spit them out alive 3 days later is a whale, so that's a solid assumption. But I am not completely sold on the idea, though, that Jonah is the good guy of the story. Not that he's a bad guy, but he kind of feels a little bit of an antagonist role in here. And the Ninevites, they're a little bit also of an antagonist. They're also a whole lot of a plot device used to be able to tell the story a little bit. And that's kind of where they are in there. And I think that really, like, the hero of the story, and you can say this of every story that's in the Bible, but this one in particular, it is more true than others. I think the hero of the story, the protagonist here, is God. Because God is doing something very different with these things that are going on. The story isn't nearly as cut and dried, at least as it was when I learned it when I was about this tall. Because I learned the story in the same way that many of you did, which is Jonah is the hero of the story. God calls him to go and set those wicked, evil, horrible Ninevites in their place so that they go and they do the right thing. And this is the classical story of evangelism. God calls someone to go. They say, "Are you really sure you want me to do this?" Jonah turns away. He says, "I don't want to go there." God, most of us don't get knocked into the belly of a whale for 3 days, but God sends Jonah into the belly of a whale for 3 days so Jonah can reconsider his options. And then Jonah goes out and he does the thing that God has called him to, right? And everyone lives happily ever after the end. That's how we learn the story, right? I don't think it's quite nearly that cut and dried. And here's where I'm beginning to focus a lot of my attention as we come into this. And it comes from the last part of our reading for today. It's the king of Nineveh making this proclamation, but it's a proclamation we can hear all throughout this story. It says, "Let all persons stop. Let all persons stop their evil ways and turn towards God." The long arc of redemption that is the Bible, time and time again, we see God doing this thing, where God is pushing the boundaries of certainly Jonah's expectations here, but of others. Such that even for those folks where maybe their faith doesn't stick in the long term, but they will turn to God for a short time, even if they are not a part of God's chosen people. Remember, it was just a few weeks ago we were telling the story of Naaman. Naaman, who was Syrian, who was a part of a very different country, was not one of God's chosen people, and yet God still healed him. I mean, it took a bit because Naaman goes to Elisha, and Elisha sent him basically an email that said, "Just go and wash yourself in the Jordan River, and then you'll be fine." And Naaman said, "That river's dirty. I don't want to do that." Finally, someone talks him sense in him. He goes, he washes, and he is cleansed of his skin disease. Naaman was not one of God's chosen people. But yet we see God do this all over, enough to know that it's not just God, kind of doing something a little strange every once in a while, but know that this is an intentional thing that God is doing, reaching out to folks that don't fit our expectations. God is not done with them. Let all persons stop their evil behaviors and turn towards God. Now hold on to that thought for a second, because we're going to make a radical turn here for a moment, a little bit longer than a moment. This morning I'm putting things together I never would have thought I'd ever put together in a sermon before, but I like how it all fits together. Earlier this week, we were at home and we were watching Cocomelon. If you have anyone that is under 3 feet tall, you know what this show is. We sit there and we watch it, and it is the show that we watch the most in our house, because it's the one that Jack likes the most. It's so much so that I even have it on my phone in a couple of different formats. I've got it in MP3 so that we can listen to it in the truck or in the car when someone just getting a little grouchy because we've been in there for too long. I can turn that on, and it works a little bit to kind of calm them down a bit. And then I have it on video for if we're sitting down at a restaurant or we are someplace if we're sitting down at a restaurant and he is done and he is ready to be up and moving around, and he's decided he doesn't want to sit here anymore, I can pull that out, and that kind of pacifies him a little bit so that he doesn't get quite too squirrely while we're sitting down at dinner. But I've got it on all sorts of different places, and if you've heard me talk about this at all, you know I kind of like this show. That if you've got a kid and you've got a toddler and they've got to binge watch something, there are far worse things that they could be watching than this. And so I'm okay with it, and I like it. But there is one song, though, that comes up that Emily and I both agree on that neither one of us really likes. And it's called The Country Mouse and the City Mouse. And if you've not heard the song before, that's okay. I'm not going to play it for you now, because you don't need that song stuck in your head. Emily's already going to get me later because it's going to be stuck in her head for the rest of the day. Probably Grandma and Grandma over there too, because they've heard it a lot also.
It was on this morning.
It was on this morning. Okay, yeah, check. But if you haven't ever heard the song, you probably know how the story goes, because it's not a new story. The song is new, but the story is not new, because in fact I just went to Amazon this week and got the Little Golden Book Classic Edition that has the Country Mouse and the City Mouse and other stories on there. I remember hearing this story probably in a book very similar to this when I was little. And it's one that's out there. Now we're going to work with the song a little bit this morning, because that's one that's most fresh in my mind. But the basics of the story are that there is a country mouse and a city mouse, and they are very good friends. Sorry, dear, that's stuck now, I know. That's the refrain you're going to hear all throughout this, and they were very good friends. And the story goes, the country mouse invites the city mouse to come out and see him. The city mouse comes out, he gets out there, he has no idea what to expect when he gets out to the country like that. He doesn't like the food, he doesn't like where they're staying, he doesn't really particularly care for anything that is out there in the country, and so he turns around and he leaves very quickly. But they were very good friends. Next part of the song is that the city mouse says, hey, let me invite you to come to the city. So he invites the country mouse to come into the city. They go in there. The city mouse lives in this wonderfully decadent apartment. And he comes in showing him all the sights of the city. You get up onto the big dining room table, and there's cakes, there's big blocks of cheese. There's all the things that you could want. It looks like a wonderful place, except for this cat that is standing there staring at them, ready to chase them down and go and get them. And the country mouse decides, I think I kind of like my country life a little bit better. And so he goes home, but they are still very good friends. That's kind of the way the song goes. Emily and I are both kind of in agreement that we don't really like the city mouse all that much. We think actually the way they tell that story, that the city mouse is kind of the bad guy of the story, that he is the one that is kind of full of himself, and he just assumes that where he is naturally better than his friend out from the country. And in our story, in our scripture reading for this morning, Jonah is the city mouse. Told you there was going to be a connection there. Nothing, just make you believe it. Jonah is making all sorts of assumptions about Nineveh. Now, to be fair, these were well-earned assumptions about Nineveh, that it was a bad place, it was an evil place. They were not good people, especially by our standards today. We would say that this is a thing. That we would argue that, yes, Nineveh is in fact a very bad place. But in Jonah's time, by Jonah's standards, Nineveh wasn't that far off of the norm. Like there were a bunch of places you could look at and you could say, oh, that looks an awful lot like Nineveh. It wasn't that far out of what was expected. They were different from Jonah, for sure, very much so. He very much had cause to worry, but this was also a part of the world that he lived in, and he knew what to expect. Jonah's biggest problem, though, was his own feelings of superiority over the Ninevites. And this is in fact what God is really coming down on him on, because when we get to the end of the book of Jonah, this is the argument that God and Jonah are having. Well, Jonah assumes they're having an argument. God is saying, no, Jonah, this is the way things are. I'm just trying to help you get here to realize this. But that's where the book of Jonah ends. It's like there's not a lot of resolution to this discussion that they were having, where Jonah is completely and thoroughly convinced that no, the Ninevites are an okay group of people to go and reach out to. Jonah just can't accept that. Hey, you know what? They're different from me, sure, but they can also be followers of God. Jonah isn't a great hero of the Bible so much as he is just a guy who is struggling to understand that the world is bigger than he has come to understand it. And he doesn't want it to be that way. So much so he doesn't want it to be that way. He likes being the city mouse and the place that he gives him. He doesn't want to have to acknowledge that the country mouse could also be just as good as him. As a side note, in the song version of this story, and they were very good friends, after a while you start to listen to it, you start to begin to say, I think the folks who put this song together were being really subtle in the way they phrased all of this, that they may not have been very good friends. After a while, you kind of start to wonder if they were. But I think this is where God is pushing the story. God is pushing the boundaries that Jonah was expecting of who gets counted, of who is considered one of God's people, of who it is that can be redeemed and forgiven, that also even the Ninevites could be redeemed and they could be forgiven. And God is working on Jonah to grow. Now you heard me say before, this is the book of Jonah gets used to describe the traditional way that we do evangelism, that we are called by God to go and share the gospel with all the people, and we go out and we share that with them. Somewhere along the way, maybe we aren't completely in agreement with how that goes, and so God has to encourage us. Most of us don't get swallowed by a whale, that's good. But he encourages us to go out and do it, and we go and we do, and we can go and we can evangelize. That's the traditional model of evangelism. It is a one-direction sort of thing that takes place there. But this is where I say that I think God is actually the hero of this story in more ways than not. Because what we're finding is that just as much as God is calling Jonah to go out and to share redemption with the Ninevites, God is also working to evangelize Jonah, saying, you've got your own things you got to work on that you need to understand, because I'm not exactly who you think I am. There is more here to this. And God's message to Jonah is that the world is bigger than you expect. Yes, even the country mouse is a person too. Let all persons stop their evil ways and turn towards God. In this case, all means all. And Jonah struggles with it, because it was also forcing him to accept parts of himself that he didn't necessarily want to, because he had to accept the Ninevites. He had to stop, and Jonah had to stop doing the things that were taking him away from God, because this is a two-way street. It's not so much that he is being sent to tell someone, but he is being changed in the process of it also. If there is a message that comes from the story of the country mouse and the city mouse, and you could also, this is the way the story changes over time, is that you could, if you read the book version of this, you would say Jonah is the country mouse. And so it kind of all works in lots of different directions. But if there's a message that comes from the story, it's that it's okay that they were very different people. More important, though, is that they recognize that the other person is in fact a person, and that they're all different, and that's okay, because they can be very good friends. Being good friends, but from very different places. Neither one is perfect. Just as with Jonah and the Ninevites, both are very different. Both have sins they need forgiveness of, and they are both in need of redemption. In fact, this is a very common story throughout human history that we tell in lots of different ways. We see this happen time and time again. This past week I ran across another story. I told you there were a lot of things that get combined that I never thought I would combine before this morning, but I ran across another story. It's in a part of a daily devotion that I get that's called With God Daily. The subtitle under that is a daily devotion for people who don't like daily devotions. I was skeptical at first because I'm not someone who normally likes daily devotions, but I've had this for several months now, and I really do appreciate this. And sometimes I skim it more than others, but I will always stop my day to read what the guy who writes these devotions, his name is Sky Jethani. That's not a name he made up for publication purposes. That is his legitimate name. Like if you're an author couldn't come up with a name quite like that and have it be believable, but that is his actual name. He gives me some interesting things to think about. And this week, one of them was, I'm going to read you part of this devotion. He starts it like this. In 1995, Nelson Mandela appointed Bishop Desmond Tutu to lead South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission with a seemingly impossible task: heal the country. After generations of racial injustice and violence, after the downfall of the apartheid regime, many black South Africans, having been oppressed by the white minority for decades, felt justifiable anger and a desire for retribution. On the other side, the outgoing white government wanted complete amnesty for their crimes. Mandela knew the tension in his country could escalate into civil war if the Truth and Reconciliation Commission didn't find a way forward. Bishop Tutu believed South Africa could only heal if crimes committed by the white government were forgiven, but he believed blanket amnesty would be unjust and further harm those already victimized by apartheid. Instead, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission offered forgiveness only if the guilty individuals came forward and publicly confessed their crimes in detail. Such truth-telling would honor the victims, shine a light of truth on the atrocities committed, and offer closure to grieving families who never knew what happened to their missing loved ones. After years of work, the Commission presented its full report in 1998. But it was not well received by Nelson Mandela or other black leaders of South Africa's new government. To their surprise, Bishop Tutu's commission hadn't just uncovered crimes committed by white South Africans against blacks, but it also reported that the many atrocities committed by blacks, including some who occupied leadership roles in the new government, like the Inkatha Freedom Party and the African National Congress, and even Nelson Mandela's own wife. We always, he continues on, we always want to believe that our group is righteous and those opposed to us are wicked. It's comforting to think categories of good and evil neatly overlap the labels us and them. This kind of tribal loyalty animates our politics, our communities, and even our churches and theological traditions. The truth, as the South Africans discovered, is that we all stand on level ground before the cross. All have sinned, all have rebelled against God, all have mistreated their neighbors through what we have done and by what we have left undone. All we, like sheep, have gone astray. That really kind of hit me this week as he was saying those things. And in that last part that he said in there, every time I read it, I hear in my mind the confession and pardon that we read when we do the full liturgy for communion. It's those same words coming back again. The thing that makes Jesus' message so very powerful is that he says, none are innocent. If you're trying to start something to really get people to believe in your cause and to follow where you lead, that's not where you lead with, that none are innocent. But also none are as guilty as their opponents or enemies think. Most powerful of all is that all are God's children. This was what tore through first century communities that were beginning to hear Jesus' gospel for the very first time. It was so very different from what they had known and their traditions that they were a part of that are all based on, first it's us versus them. Here we are here and it's them over there, and it naturally sets up these divisions. Jesus says, no, it's not one over the other, but it is one together with the other. We live in a world that is fragmented, not just into us or them, but these days it's us or them or those people or those over there, or there's all sorts of groups. It actually becomes endless after a while, the many different places that we have divided into. Jesus tells us this is not the world that God intended. This is not what he wants. And we see this all throughout Scripture, that God is always pushing those boundaries, whether it's the Ninevites, whether it's others, whether in the time of the return from the exile, God was using a Persian king to come and help the Israelites figure this out. God goes beyond the boundaries that we expect and says, let all persons stop their evil ways and turn towards him. Let us be the voices that join and share with others this same truth. And let us see what happens when we do. Because this is the thing, we see what happens with those first century communities. A message that should never work because it's completely different than the message that others knew around them is the one that begins to take root and takes hold and begins to lead and build lives and communities and nations and change the world. So let us work to do the same thing. We don't have to be great at it. We just have to try and start working in that direction. And let us see what happens when we do. And let us do this all in Christ's name. Amen.